It was a day like any other on the Galaxium, the massive floating city of the Galactic Council. Ships from countless alien species orbited around the station, exchanging goods, knowledge, and ideas. It was a place where the most brilliant minds of the galaxy gathered, a place where history was made. Yet today, something extraordinary was about to happen. In the heart of the council hall, the grand chamber was filled with representatives from various species, each known for their advanced intelligence and technological prowess. At the center of the room sat an artifact, an object so strange and unusual that it baffled even the most seasoned scientists. It had been found on a distant, uninhabited moon, buried deep beneath layers of rock and dust. The artifact was of an unknown material, smooth and gleaming, but covered in mysterious symbols none could understand. The room fell silent as the council's experts from different races studied it. Most had tried and failed to decipher its meaning. The best minds of the galaxy had pored over it for weeks, but none had made any progress. The object was silent, its secrets locked away, refusing to reveal itself to any of them. Among the council members was Kira, a tall and graceful alien from the Oran species. Her people were known for their intellectual abilities, and she had earned a reputation as one of the smartest minds in the galaxy. Kira was confident, almost certain that the answers to the artifact's mystery lay within her grasp. She had worked on countless puzzles and riddles over the years, solving them with ease. But this one was different. Kira paced back and forth in front of the artifact, her eyes narrowing as she analyzed it. She could feel the pressure mounting on her. There was no doubt in her mind that she could figure it out. The others were growing frustrated, but she remained calm. The symbols seemed familiar to her, but they did not match anything from her own people's history. There was something unusual about them. Something alien, but still almost human. As she stared at the artifact, a voice interrupted her thoughts. "We must do something. The council cannot afford to remain stalled on this," said Zilnax, a representative from the Sother species. Zilnax was an amphibious being with 2 sets of eyes and a reputation for being more aggressive in his approach to problems. "Perhaps it's time to try something new." Kira turned sharply at his words, her eyes narrowing. She had worked tirelessly on this puzzle, and now, it seemed, someone was questioning her abilities. "What do you suggest, Zilnax?" Kira asked coolly, her voice calm but sharp. Zilnax grinned, his 4 eyes blinking at her. "A human," he said, his tone laced with sarcasm. "Let a human try. Maybe their primitive ways can finally make sense of this." A wave of laughter spread through the room. The idea of a human solving the puzzle was ridiculous. Humans, though capable, were still considered a young and less advanced species compared to the other races of the galaxy. They had only recently begun exploring space, and most saw them as naive, with little understanding of the complex matters that dominated galactic politics. Kira stiffened at the suggestion. Her pride was wounded by the implication. She was certain that no human, no matter how clever, could solve this puzzle. Still, she kept her emotions in check, as she always did. The council's decision would be final. "Let the humans try," Zilnax pressed, "but only if you're willing to allow them a chance. Perhaps their simplicity might bring something fresh to the table." Kira frowned. "Very well," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "We shall allow them one chance." The council murmured in agreement. A few minutes later, Mark Redding, a young human scientist, stood up from the corner of the room where he had been quietly observing. Mark wasn't famous or particularly well known, but he had a reputation for being unusually persistent. He had a knack for solving problems that others found too complicated or frustrating. His curiosity was boundless, and he often saw things that others overlooked. With a quiet confidence, Mark walked up to the artifact. Kira watched closely, her arms crossed. The others chuckled quietly among themselves, convinced that Mark would fail just like the rest. He was a human, after all. How could he possibly understand something so complex? Mark stood in front of the artifact and studied it carefully. The silence in the room was thick, the tension almost unbearable. Mark seemed calm, his eyes scanning the symbols, his mind working rapidly to make sense of the strange markings. Kira continued to observe, still skeptical. She had seen humans before, but none had impressed her with their intellect, until now. Mark's focus was different. He wasn't trying to rush through the problem like some of the others. He was patient, taking the time to truly understand each line, each curve, each symbol on the artifact's surface. Suddenly, a thought sparked in Mark's mind. He stepped back, took a deep breath, and then returned to the artifact. A slow smile crept across his face as he reached out and touched one of the symbols with a finger. The artifact hummed lightly, reacting to his touch. Kira blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected this. The artifact, it seemed, was responding to him. The hum of the artifact's strange energy filled the room as Mark continued to study it. The once silent object now seemed to pulse in rhythm with his touch, and the room was suddenly filled with a buzz of excitement. Kira, standing nearby, had her arms crossed tightly, her eyes narrowing in disbelief. She had expected the human to fail, just like everyone else had. But here he was, touching the artifact as though it was meant for him. Impossible, Kira whispered under her breath, but loud enough for the others to hear. The other council members, who had been watching with mild interest, were now staring at Mark in stunned silence. Zilnax, who had pushed for the human to try, grinned widely, his 4 eyes glimmering with amusement. Mark stepped back and raised his hand. "It's starting to make sense," he said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. The council members exchanged puzzled glances. They could not understand what Mark had seen in the artifact that had eluded them for so long. The symbols had no clear pattern, no obvious meaning. "Explain," Kira demanded, her voice colder now. She didn't like how confident he seemed. It was as if he believed he had cracked the mystery when there was no possible way to do so. Mark turned to face her, his face calm. "It's not about what we know. It's about what we don't know. I think this artifact is trying to communicate through patterns, not through direct meaning." He walked closer to the artifact, gently touching it again. "These symbols are not words. They are hints, like a code. And like any code, it requires you to think beyond what's immediately obvious." The others looked at each other. They didn't see it. The idea of something so advanced being cracked by a human was beyond their understanding. Kira, especially, felt a pang of frustration. Her people had developed incredible technology and knowledge over thousands of years, but here was a human, a species that had barely begun to explore the galaxy, standing before the artifact as though it were just another puzzle to solve. "Why don't you just tell us what it means?" Zilnax said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "If it's so simple, human, why not share your brilliance?" Mark smiled, but it wasn't a smug smile. It was a focused, thoughtful expression. "It's not about telling you. It's about showing you. This artifact is waiting for us to understand it in the right way." Kira scoffed. She was used to being the smartest person in the room, and she didn't like how Mark seemed so sure of himself. It bothered her that someone who wasn't even part of the council was gaining attention for his insight. "Well then, human," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "If you think you can solve this, then show us. Solve it. Now." The challenge was out there, and there was no turning back. The council watched in anticipation. Mark paused for a moment, as if weighing his next move. He looked around at the alien species who had gathered. Some were curious, some skeptical, but all were waiting for him to fail. He turned back to the artifact, taking a deep breath. This was more than just a test of his intelligence. It was a test of humanity itself. Could humans, with all their flaws and inexperience, really solve something that had stumped the greatest minds of the galaxy? Mark wasn't sure, but he was determined to try. He had always believed that if you looked at things from a different angle, you could see new possibilities, and that's what he intended to do. Mark bent closer to the artifact, his fingers lightly tracing the symbols again. This time, however, he wasn't just studying them. He was thinking of patterns, of how the symbols might relate to one another in ways no one had considered before. It wasn't about brute force or advanced technology. It was about recognizing connections. "What are you seeing?" Kira asked, her tone less harsh but still tinged with doubt. Mark didn't answer immediately. He was too focused. Slowly, he began to move his hands, not touching the artifact, but shifting the air around it. There was something in the way the light from the room interacted with the surface of the object that Mark had noticed, a subtle shift that others had missed. "I think the artifact isn't just a puzzle. It's a test," Mark said. "It wants to know if we can think in ways that go beyond logic, beyond knowledge. It's asking us to think with something else. I think it's asking for intuition." At that moment, Mark stepped back and took another deep breath. His eyes closed for a split second. Kira, watching intently, noticed something in his posture. There was a calmness about him, a quiet confidence that seemed at odds with the rest of the room's tension. For the first time, Kira wondered if Mark might be onto something. Suddenly, the artifact emitted a soft glow, a light that spread from the center to the edges. It wasn't bright enough to blind them, but it was enough to make everyone in the room step back. The glow pulsed in rhythm with Mark's breathing, almost as though the artifact were reacting to him. "Wait, is it working?" Zilnax asked, his voice filled with disbelief. Mark opened his eyes and nodded. "It's responding. The artifact. It's alive in a way. It's waiting for us to understand it, but not with just our minds. It's like a conversation, not a solution." The room fell silent. The council members were no longer laughing. They were watching, completely transfixed by what was happening before them. Kira felt a strange feeling of awe growing inside her. She had always believed in logic, in the power of knowledge and reason. But here, before her, was a human, one of the youngest, most underestimated species in the galaxy, unlocking a mystery that had baffled even the greatest minds. "I think," Mark said slowly, "we need to think like humans do. We need to believe that there's more to discovery than just facts and logic. Maybe, just maybe, that's what this artifact is teaching us." Kira stared at him. She hadn't expected this. She had underestimated him. And now she realized how wrong she had been. The room was silent now, save for the soft hum of the artifact, which seemed to pulse gently in the dim light. The glow had faded, but the tension remained thick in the air. Mark stood still in front of the artifact, his hand hovering just above its surface, as if he were waiting for it to reveal the next step. Kira, who had been standing with her arms crossed, felt a growing sense of unease. The other council members, Zilnax, the amphibious Sother, and the others, had stopped whispering among themselves. Instead, they were all watching Mark with a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Kira, despite her deep intelligence and years of study, could not deny the truth that was slowly unfolding before her. A human, one who was only beginning to understand the stars, was doing something none of them could. Kira forced herself to speak, though her voice was not as strong as she had hoped. "What are you seeing, human?" she asked, trying to mask her uncertainty. "What is it that none of us could find?" Mark turned to her, his expression calm but focused. "It's all about connections," he said simply. "You see, the artifact isn't just a puzzle of symbols. It's a map. But it's not a normal map. It's a map of thought, a map of concepts. Each symbol represents an idea, not just a picture. To understand it, we need to think of it like a story. Each part connects to the next, like a chain." Kira frowned. "A story. But the symbols, they don't form any words we recognize, and the material is unlike anything we've seen before." Mark nodded, agreeing but not bothered by the challenge. "That's because you're thinking of it as a puzzle of facts. You're trying to fit it into what you already know. But sometimes we have to approach things differently." The artifact seemed to react as he spoke. It pulsed softly, and the symbols shifted slightly. Mark, sensing the change, leaned closer, his eyes tracing the lines and patterns on the surface. His fingers moved slowly, almost like a dance, touching certain points on the artifact that seemed to trigger faint vibrations. "Look," Mark said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "These symbols are like ancient runes, but they're not just telling us what's on the surface. They're about connecting ideas. These shapes, they represent concepts we don't use in the same way. What if they're telling us a story, not in words, but in ideas?" Zilnax, still skeptical, raised a voice that echoed in the chamber. "But how can a human see something we cannot? We've all studied the symbols, tried to make sense of them." "I think that's the problem," Mark said, his voice steady. "You've been trying to solve it like it's a code you already understand. You're using your knowledge, but it's not the right knowledge." Kira stood back, her brow furrowed. She knew Mark was right. There was something about his approach that felt different, almost like he wasn't trying to fit the artifact into the box of their galaxy's knowledge. He was thinking in a way that none of them had. He was thinking like a human. The room felt oddly quiet now. The other council members seemed to be watching Mark with new eyes. No longer was he just a human. He was becoming something else, someone who might have cracked the code of a mystery they had failed to understand. Mark continued to touch the artifact, his fingers moving lightly over the surface, tracing the symbols and their connections. He began speaking more to the council than to the artifact. "You see, this map isn't just about stars or locations. It's about ideas. Ideas about energy, space, time. What if these symbols are a way of showing us something bigger than we can imagine? Something we're not supposed to understand with our eyes, but with our minds?" Kira watched as Mark's hands moved over the artifact in a fluid motion. It was as though he was listening to something beyond the physical object itself. The glow of the artifact dimmed and brightened, as if it were in tune with Mark's thoughts. "What do you mean by that?" Kira asked, a note of genuine curiosity creeping into her voice despite herself. Mark didn't answer immediately. Instead, he closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if searching for the right words. Then he spoke again, his voice calm but full of conviction. "I think these symbols represent something deeper. Not just what we see, but how we think. We, humans, are used to thinking in ways that others might not. We use imagination, intuition. When you look at this, you don't just see symbols. You see something that can be connected to ideas we're not even fully aware of. Like the way the first humans looked at the stars and told stories. These symbols could be part of a much larger pattern. A pattern of knowledge and energy that exists everywhere." The room was silent for a long time. Mark's words hung in the air, and Kira found herself lost in thought. She had always believed that intelligence came from knowledge, facts, logic, and advanced technologies. But Mark was talking about something different. He was talking about using the mind in ways she had never considered. Could it be that humanity's strength wasn't in the advanced technology they used, but in the way they connected ideas, the way they used imagination and creativity? "Wait a minute," Zilnax interrupted suddenly, his voice sharp. "Are you suggesting that this artifact isn't about technology? That it's not some ancient alien device for manipulating energy?" Mark looked up at him and smiled. "Exactly. I think the artifact is showing us that the greatest energy in the universe doesn't come from technology alone. It comes from understanding. It comes from the connections between ideas. That's why no one could figure it out before. They were looking in the wrong direction. We were all thinking too much like machines." Kira couldn't help but stare at Mark. There was something in his words that felt true. Something that made her question everything she had believed about intelligence and discovery. As the artifact seemed to hum in agreement with Mark's words, she realized something. The human mind, with all its flaws, its creativity, and its need to explore the unknown, had unlocked something profound. Kira looked at the artifact again, this time with new eyes. For the first time, she understood what Mark had meant. This wasn't just about technology. It was about thinking differently. And maybe, just maybe, That was the key to unlocking the greatest mysteries of the universe. The chamber was quiet as Mark stood in front of the glowing artifact, his hand still gently tracing its symbols. The council members were staring at him, their expressions a mixture of awe and disbelief. Kira, who had been so sure that the humans would never grasp the complexity of the artifact, now found herself questioning everything she had believed about intelligence and discovery. Mark had done something none of them had expected. He had made a connection, one that none of the council members, no matter how intelligent, had been able to make. But what did it mean? And how was this human able to do it where they had failed? The soft hum of the artifact continued to fill the room. Its glow seemed to change with each movement of Mark's fingers, and the symbols on its surface shifted ever so slightly. It was as if the artifact was reacting to his thoughts. The council was now looking at him with a new kind of respect, though some were still hesitant to fully embrace the idea that a human could be the one to unlock its secrets. Zilnax, the Tsothar representative, spoke first, his voice still tinged with disbelief. "This is beyond anything we expected. It's almost as if the artifact is alive." Mark nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the shifting symbols. "I think it is, at least in a way. It's not alive in the way we understand life, but it's responding to the way we think. It's almost like the artifact is testing us. It's waiting for us to connect the dots." Kira, who had been silent for a long time, took a step forward. She had been watching Mark carefully, her sharp mind working to understand what he was seeing. Despite herself, she was beginning to see the logic in his words. Her pride, however, made it hard for her to admit it. "But what kind of connection is it looking for?" Kira asked, her voice still calm, but with a hint of curiosity that hadn't been there before. "You speak of ideas, intuition, but how does that help us understand the artifact?" Mark smiled, but it wasn't a boastful smile. It was a thoughtful one. "The artifact isn't just about understanding knowledge. It's about seeing things in a new way. It's a puzzle, yes, but it's more than that. It's asking us to go beyond logic, to trust our instincts." Kira frowned, but this time her expression was less defensive. She could feel the truth in Mark's words, even though she didn't want to admit it. For so long, she had relied on reason, on her species' advanced technology, to solve problems. It was difficult for her to accept that a human, with all their supposed imperfections, could approach the problem in a way that none of them had thought of before. As Mark continued to focus on the artifact, the room fell silent again. He seemed to be in a trance, his movements slow and deliberate. The artifact responded to his touch, shifting its symbols in a way that none of the council members could have predicted. It wasn't just a puzzle anymore. It was a conversation, one that Mark was having with the artifact, and perhaps with the universe itself. Suddenly, the room was filled with a soft, melodic tone. It was not loud, but it was clear, and it seemed to come from the artifact itself. The symbols on its surface began to glow brighter, and the glow pulsed in rhythm with the sound. It was as if the artifact was singing a song that only Mark could hear. "What's happening?" Zilnax asked, his voice filled with wonder. "I think it's communicating," Mark said, his voice low. "It's trying to show us something we've been missing." Kira stepped closer, her eyes wide. She had never seen anything like this. The artifact, which had been an enigma just hours ago, was now responding to Mark in ways that none of them had imagined. The strange symbols seemed to form new patterns, ones that made more sense than any of the patterns the council had tried to decipher before. Mark's face lit up as he connected the final piece. "It's not just a map or a code," he said, his voice filled with excitement. "It's a guide to understanding the very fabric of the universe itself. The symbols represent the forces that bind everything together: time, space, energy, and matter. They're not just abstract ideas. They're the building blocks of reality." Kira blinked in surprise. The artifact was showing them something far more profound than they had ever imagined. It wasn't just a relic from an ancient civilization. It was a key, a key to understanding the deepest secrets of the universe. What do you mean? Kira asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She could hardly believe what Mark was saying, but the excitement in his voice was contagious. Are you saying the artifact is telling us how to control the forces of nature? Mark nodded slowly. Exactly. But it's not about controlling them. It's about understanding them. The artifact is showing us that we are all connected. Everything in the universe is tied together by these forces. If we learn to understand them, we can learn to coexist with them. We can learn to live in harmony with the universe, instead of trying to control it. The room was silent for a moment, as the council members absorbed Mark's words. It was a radical idea, one that challenged everything they had believed about power and knowledge. For centuries, the various species in the galaxy had sought to master the forces of nature, to control them for their own gain. But what Mark was suggesting was different. It wasn't about power, it was about balance. Kira, who had always believed that knowledge was the key to everything, now found herself rethinking her beliefs. Perhaps the humans, with their fresh perspective and their ability to think differently, had found a path that none of the other species had considered. As the artifact's glow slowly faded, Mark stood up, his eyes still fixed on the symbols. We've been looking at the universe all wrong. It's not about conquering or controlling. It's about understanding. It's about learning to live with the forces that govern everything. The council members looked at each other, unsure of what to say. They had come to this chamber with a puzzle to solve, but what they were leaving with was something far greater. A new way of thinking, a new way of understanding the universe. And all of it had come from a human. Someone they had once thought of as too young and too simple to comprehend the mysteries of the stars. For the first time, Kira understood what Mark had meant. Humans weren't just good at thinking outside the box. They were good at seeing the box for what it really was, and understanding that sometimes the answers weren't about logic or power, but about balance and connection. The chamber was filled with a quiet energy as the council members absorbed Mark's words. The artifact had stopped glowing, and the melodic hum had faded into nothingness. The symbols on its surface had returned to their original state, but something had changed. The room felt different, as if the very air had shifted. Kira was the first to speak, though her voice was tinged with uncertainty. Are you saying that this artifact is teaching us to live in harmony with the forces of nature? To stop trying to control them? Mark nodded. His expression was calm but determined. Yes, that's exactly what I mean. It's not about dominance. It's about understanding how everything is connected. Once we realize that, we'll see that we don't need to control nature. We need to work with it. Kira felt a surge of conflict inside her. She had spent her entire life learning about power, about how to harness the forces of the universe to create new technologies, to expand her people's reach across the stars. To think that the answer wasn't about power, but about balance, was a concept she had never considered. But how can we trust that this is the right path? She asked, her voice softer now. How do we know the artifact's message is true? Mark looked directly at her, his eyes filled with understanding. That's the tricky part. We don't know for sure. But the artifact has shown us something that we've all missed. We've been too focused on controlling things, on bending them to our will. Maybe the key is to stop fighting the universe and start understanding it. Zilnax, who had remained silent for some time, spoke up. This is strange. Our species has always believed that understanding the universe meant mastering it. This idea of balance, of not trying to control everything, doesn't make sense to us. We've built our civilizations on power. Mark glanced around the room at the council members, who all shared Zilnax's skepticism. He could see that they were struggling with the concept, just as Kira had. But he also knew that this was a chance for them to change, to see the universe in a new way. I know it's hard to understand, Mark said, his voice steady. But think about it. Every time we try to control something, whether it's energy, time, or even life itself, there are consequences. We try to bend things to our will, But nature always finds a way to push back. What if we stopped fighting? What if we started working with the universe instead of against it? There was a long pause as the council members exchanged glances. Mark's words seemed to resonate with them, even if they didn't fully understand it. Kira could see the doubt in their eyes, but there was also something else. An openness, a curiosity, a willingness to consider the possibility of a different way. Finally, Kira spoke again. I've always believed that knowledge was the key to everything. That if we understood enough, we could overcome any obstacle. But now, I'm not so sure. Mark smiled. That's all any of us can do. Question what we think we know, and be open to new ideas. The council members fell into thoughtful silence. Mark's words had started to change the way they viewed their own actions. If they could work together, understanding the balance of forces that govern the universe, perhaps they could achieve something even greater than control. The quiet was broken by a voice from the back of the room. It was Silnara, the youngest member of the council, who had been unusually quiet throughout the entire discussion. What if the artifact isn't just showing us a new way of thinking about the universe? What if it's showing us how to live in peace with each other? The room turned toward her, and Kira raised an eyebrow in surprise. Zilnara's question was unexpected, but it held an intriguing truth. The council members had been so focused on understanding the universe and controlling its forces that they had neglected their own relationships, their own balance. They had been too concerned with power and expansion to truly consider what it meant to live in harmony with each other. Mark nodded, clearly impressed by Xilnara's insight. I think you're right. The balance we need to find isn't just about nature. It's about us too. About learning to live together, to respect each other's differences, and to build something greater than ourselves. Kira's eyes softened as she listened to Mark's words. She realized that, in their pursuit of power and control, her people had forgotten what it meant to be truly connected to one another. They had built great machines, amazing technologies, but they had lost sight of the deeper connections that held them together. What do we do now? Zilnax asked, his voice filled with a sense of both uncertainty and hope. Mark took a deep breath. I think it's time we start thinking differently. Not just about technology, but about how we relate to the universe and to each other. We don't need to master everything. We need to understand it and find ways to live in balance with it. The council members looked around at one another. The air in the room was still thick with uncertainty, but there was also something else, something new, a sense of possibility. They had always thought that control was the key to power, but now they were beginning to see that balance was the key to true strength. We'll need to rethink everything, Kira said slowly, her voice thoughtful. Our way of thinking, our way of interacting with the galaxy, everything. Mark smiled. Exactly. And that's the first step. The more we understand the balance, the more we can create a future where all species, humans, aliens, everyone, can live together in peace. The council members nodded, some with hesitation, others with growing excitement. The road ahead was uncertain, and the path would be long. But for the first time, they felt that they were on the right track. A track that didn't lead to control, but to understanding. A track that didn't lead to conflict, but to harmony. Mark had opened their eyes to something new. And now, they were ready to see where that path would lead. The council room buzzed with quiet conversation, the weight of what they had just learned hanging in the air like a heavy fog. Each member had been changed by Mark's words. The idea of living in harmony with the universe, instead of trying to control it, had shaken them. But there was no turning back now. The questions Mark had raised were too important, too profound, to ignore. Kira paced slowly across the room, her mind spinning with the possibilities. She had always believed in the power of knowledge, of understanding the universe's mechanics, bending them to her will. But now she saw the flaws in that approach. For the first time, she could see the cracks in her worldview. If what Mark said was true, if balance really was the answer, then everything she had worked for, Everything her people had strived to achieve might need to be rethought. Zilnax, the Sotha representative, stood near the window, looking out at the vast expanse of stars. His expression was serious, his long fingers tapping against his chin as he mulled over the new ideas they had just uncovered. "I've never thought of it this way," he admitted, his voice soft. "We've always believed that by controlling the forces of nature, we could protect ourselves and our civilizations. But what if we've been fighting against something far greater than us?" "I think we have," Kira said quietly, turning to face him. "We've been fighting the flow of the universe, trying to shape it into something we can control. But in the process, we've ignored the truth. Everything is connected, and we're not separate from it." Mark, standing at the center of the room, listened to their conversation with a calm but focused expression. He could see the change in their eyes. It wasn't an easy shift to make. They had spent their lives, their entire cultures, focused on mastering the universe. But the idea of balance, of coexistence, was foreign to them. And yet, it was the very thing that could unlock a future none of them had ever imagined. Zilnara, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. Her voice was filled with excitement. "If we embrace this idea, if we start thinking this way, then maybe we can finally stop the endless wars. Maybe we can stop fighting over resources, over space, over everything we think we need to control." Mark nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Exactly. The universe isn't something we need to dominate. It's something we need to live with. If we can understand its natural balance, we can stop fighting each other and start working together." Zilnax turned from the window, his eyes now filled with a sense of realization. This could change everything. For all of us. Kira crossed her arms, her gaze thoughtful. "But where do we start? How do we begin to change everything we've known?" Mark's gaze softened, and he stepped forward. "We start by changing how we think. It's all about seeing the universe not as something to control, but as something to understand. Every species, every living thing, has its place in the grand design. Once we understand that, we can move forward together." Kira could feel the weight of the moment. The universe had always been a challenge to her, something to conquer, something to solve. Now she realized that the answer wasn't about solving a problem at all. It was about becoming part of the solution. It was about finding the right balance, the right connection. The council members gathered around the central table, each of them deep in thought. They were beginning to understand. It was as if the very idea that Mark had introduced was a puzzle piece they hadn't known was missing. Now that they had seen it, it was impossible to ignore. "We've always relied on technology and power," Kira said, her voice tinged with regret. "But what if that's the root of our problems? What if we've been relying too much on control, when we should have been relying on understanding?" Zilnara nodded enthusiastically. "That's it. Understanding. If we can learn to understand the universe, we don't need to fight for control. We can live in harmony with it. We can live in peace." Mark's eyes gleamed with approval. "Exactly. The power isn't in domination. It's in understanding the forces that shape everything. The artifact wasn't just teaching us about the universe. It was teaching us how to think differently. And once we think differently, we can change everything." The room was filled with a new kind of energy. It wasn't the energy of discovery or of triumph. It was the energy of hope, a hope that they could do something different, something better. For the first time in centuries, the council felt as if they weren't just trying to survive in the universe. They were part of it. But there were still challenges ahead. The way forward wouldn't be easy. The old ways of thinking wouldn't disappear overnight. There would be resistance. There always was. But Kira could feel something deep inside her, something that told her they were on the right path. This was the beginning of something new. "We need to take this to our people," Zilnax said, his voice steady. "We need to show them that the path of control, of power, has led us nowhere. We need to tell them that the future is about understanding, not dominance." Mark nodded. That's right. But we also need to lead by example. We can't just talk about balance. We need to live it. And that means showing others that peace, cooperation, and harmony are the keys to a better future. The council members exchanged looks. There was still much to do, much to learn, but the path ahead was clear. They had been given a gift, a new way of thinking, a new way of seeing the universe, and now it was their responsibility to share that gift with the galaxy. Kira felt a sense of determination settle in her chest. For the first time in a long while, she felt certain. This was not just about solving a puzzle or cracking a code. It was about something much deeper, much more important. It was about changing the way they all saw the world, and the way they lived in it. And she knew, without a doubt, that they were ready for that change. The stars outside the council chamber's window seemed brighter than before, as if they too were watching the beginning of something new. The galaxy had been shaped by conflict, by power, and by control. For centuries, species had fought for dominance over one another, each believing that mastery over the forces of the universe was the key to survival. But now, after the Council's decision, things were beginning to change. Mark stood by the window, staring out at the vast expanse of stars. His mind was still racing. What he had started with a simple observation had turned into something far larger than he had imagined. It wasn't just about an artifact or ancient knowledge anymore. It was about a new way of life, a way of understanding, not controlling. Behind him, the council was in deep discussion, planning the first steps toward this new future. Kira, Zilnax, Zilnara, and the other council members were beginning to see the possibilities. They were no longer talking about how to control resources or expand their territories. They were talking about how to create balance, about how to live in harmony with the forces that govern their universe. Kira looked up from her notes, her face thoughtful. "We'll need to send a message to the rest of the galaxy," she said, her voice serious. "If we want to make this work, if we want to show everyone that there's another way, we'll need to act quickly. The old way of thinking has been ingrained in every species for centuries. It won't be easy to convince them to change." Zilnax, his sharp features still holding a hint of doubt, nodded. "I agree. But if the artifact has shown us one thing, it's that we can't continue down the same path. We have to show the galaxy that peace and cooperation are possible." Zilnara, always eager to take action, was already sketching ideas on a nearby datavat. "What if we start with a demonstration? We could gather representatives from different species, show them how we've started living in balance. We can lead by example." Mark turned from the window and looked at the council. He could see the determination in their eyes, but he also understood their fears. This wasn't going to be easy. Changing the mindset of an entire galaxy ingrained in centuries of tradition would take time. But Mark believed in what they were doing, and he believed that they could make it work. "We need to create a space where all species can meet without the pressure of competition," Mark suggested. "A neutral space where we can all focus on understanding each other. The first step is for everyone to listen." Kira raised an eyebrow. "A neutral space? That's a bold idea. But I think you're right. If we can get species to come together and understand that we're all part of the same fabric, then we might stand a chance." Mark smiled, knowing that they were starting to agree on the next step. "We don't have to solve everything at once. It starts with small changes, one species at a time. If we can create trust, it will spread. Eventually, the message of balance will reach everyone." The council fell silent for a moment, each member thinking about the challenge ahead. The idea of living in balance with the universe was still a radical concept, but it was one that could bring about a new era. They knew that the old way of thinking, about domination and control, had reached its limits. The universe was vast, and trying to control it had only led to conflict. But if they could understand it, if they could learn to live with it, there was hope. "We should make contact with the leaders of other species," Zilnax said. "It's time to show them that the future doesn't have to be about domination. It can be about cooperation." Kira looked at Mark. You've given us something to believe in again. I've spent my life searching for answers, but I've always been looking in the wrong places. The answers aren't in control. They're in connection. They're in understanding. Mark nodded. That's the first step. Now we need to take action. We can't just talk about balance. We need to live it. And it starts with showing others that we don't have to fight for everything we want. We can work together. The council members stood up, each of them more determined than before. They knew that the path ahead would be difficult, but they were ready. It was time for a new approach, a new era of peace, cooperation, and balance. Several weeks later, the first gathering took place. Representatives from dozens of different species arrived at the neutral space that had been established, an enormous station located at the edge of a galaxy. It was a place where no one species had control, where the only rule was understanding. The station itself was a marvel of technology, designed to foster cooperation. There were no weapons, no secrets, just an open space for dialogue and learning. Mark stood at the front of the gathering, his heart racing with anticipation. This was it, the moment they had all been working toward. The representatives from the various species filed into the room, looking uncertain but curious. The tension was palpable, but there was also hope in the air. The hope that this was the beginning of something different. Kira, Zilnax, and Silnera stood with him, their faces reflecting the same mix of excitement and nervousness. They had all seen the potential of what they were trying to do, but now it was time to show everyone else. They were about to prove that balance could lead to a brighter future, not just for one species, but for all of them. As the representatives took their seats, Mark stepped forward and addressed the room. We're here today not as separate species, but as parts of a greater whole. What we've learned from the artifact, and from each other, is that the universe is not something we can control. It's something we can live with in harmony. We all have a place in it, and together we can create something better. A future of peace, cooperation, and balance. The room was silent for a moment. Then, slowly, a ripple of applause began, followed by a wave of nodding heads. The representatives were starting to understand. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but it was a beginning. Mark smiled, knowing that this was just the first step. There was still much work to do, but for the first time, the galaxy was ready to listen.